airport somewhere, and her flight has been significantly delayed. So you're stuck with us and our guest, Rebecca, for today. So first announcement before I introduce Rebecca officially. If you were not in class last week, come up at the end of class today and pick up your take-home exam. So if you don't have your take-home exam back yet, just stop here on your way out. I think we may end a little bit early, so just head up here at the end if you don't have your take-home exam yet, pick it up from one of us, and then you'll be free to go. Okay, so, Rebecca, how do you say your last name? Karam. Okay, so official introduction. Rebecca Karam is a doctoral candidate in sociology at the Cooney Graduate Center in New York City. She received her BA in sociology from the University of Michigan-Ann Arbor. Rebecca is currently conducting a study investigating the intergenerational transmission of religious beliefs and parenting strategies among second-generation Muslim American adults in metropolitan Detroit. Her research reveals the often misunderstood connections between religiosity and acculturation in contemporary Muslim American communities. She's going to share some of the key findings from her work with us today. Without further ado, Rebecca.
Hey, thank you, Kim, for the introduction. It's kind of fun to hear my research back at me. It sounds maybe a little bit more interesting when it's coming from Kim's mouth. So what I'm going to present today is a paper that I submitted for publication, and it builds off of actually Professor Karen Lacey's research. So it's too bad that she's not here, because I thought it would have been really cool for her to be able to talk more about her research in the context of what I'm about to present for you today. But the title of my paper is Becoming American by Becoming Muslim, Strategic Assimilation Among Second-Generation Muslim Americans. So I want to begin with a little bit of a paradox. The vast majority of Muslim Americans, about 9 in 10, say that they're proud to be both Muslim and American. Furthermore, almost half of Muslim Americans are native born, meaning they were born in the United States. But these findings contradict public perception, which tends to tell us that Islam is a foreign religion, one that is essentially incompatible and therefore unassimilable with American norms, that Islam poses an external enemy threat. Furthermore, Muslims who are non-white and of course non-Christian are then viewed as being doubly foreign. These views tend to feed off of and exacerbate Islamophobia, defined as a fear or hatred of Muslims and Islam more generally. And Islamophobia typically manifests itself in 3 forms in the United States: media presentations, public policy, and interpersonal acts of hostility and violence afflicted against Muslims and those perceived to be Muslim. This is really problematic, not only because it contradicts American values of pluralism, but also because it has negative impacts for Muslim Americans, especially in regards to mental and physical health. In fact, researchers studying the racialization of Islam, that is, the treatment of Muslim Americans as a racial minority, it has negative outcomes in terms of their mental, physical health, and their health-seeking behaviors. Furthermore, Muslim American parents are 4 times more likely than the general public to report that their K-12 children have been bullied in public schools. So if we want to help curb these negative effects of Islamophobia, we need to conduct research that assesses the veracity of the claims that Islam is foreign and unassimilable, and that's where my research aims to make an intervention. And it does so by asking the following research questions. How and why do some Muslim Americans embrace a religious identity that they cherish but is stigmatized by outsiders? And what social boundaries are most salient to suburban second-generation Muslim Americans in constructing particular identities? And how are these boundaries representative of their assimilation patterns? So by immigrant assimilation, I'm referring to the process by which immigrant groups or minority groups become more similar to the mainstream. Either they change to become more like the mainstream, or the mainstream changes to become more like those minority groups. Typically in the sociological literature, this has been used to explore immigrants, particularly white immigrants from Europe, as they become more like the mainstream, which is usually defined as like a homogeneous, unified white middle-class core. But scholars who were studying the post-1965 wave of immigration said, hey, racial minority status might impede that sort of ability to look and sound like the white middle class, particularly if you are an immigrant from Central America or Africa or the Middle East. So the segmented assimilation theory was presented to try and incorporate those differences in socioeconomic status and phenotype in one's ability to assimilate or not. So like, for example, you can imagine if a Cuban American were to come to this country as like a doctor or a lawyer with quite a lot of money, they're going to have a very different time assimilating than, say, a Yemeni refugee who is fleeing war and famine and only has a 5th grade education. So this perspective tries to account for those differences. And then strategic assimilation adds another layer of refinement by asking, how is it possible that upper middle class racial minorities who live in wealthy suburbs, particularly African Americans, how is it that they can, they've made it socioeconomically speaking, and yet they want to retain and cherish their racial identity, their minority identity. And so maybe you can start to see why this sort of pattern or this theory would be helpful for my research on upper middle class suburban Muslims, who again, they want to hold on to that Muslim identity. They've made it socioeconomically speaking, but they still face a lot of backlash in their everyday life. The other theory that my paper builds on is boundary work. So by boundary work, I'm talking about the process by which groups erect, maintain, and deconstruct social divisions between groups. How do they decide who's part of the in-group and out-group? Who is us and who is not us? And so sociologist Richard Alba wrote on how some boundaries, especially immigrant assimilation, can be bright, meaning very salient to our identity construction, and others are more blurry, but which boundaries are bright and blurry in what society? He wrote that these are often contextual. So in secular Europe, religion is often a very bright boundary of difference. So mainstream society is quite secular, but incoming immigrants are very religious, so that becomes a sort of a very bright boundary of difference. Whereas in the United States, since the general public tends to have a much higher level of religiosity in the first place, immigrants who come with higher levels of religiosity, they fit in okay. And so this research tends to pose Islamophobia as being a mutable phenomenon, one that will likely recede in the coming decades and has very little impact on Muslim Americans' ability to assimilate socioeconomically speaking. This literature sort of comes in conflict with all of the literature on backlash toward Muslim Americans who say basically the exact opposite thing, that religion is a bright boundary of difference in the United States, and it does affect people's socioeconomic outcomes and their overall well-being. So how do we sort of square these two findings? And so again, my research is looking to incorporate that. And another part that's very important, another big piece of this puzzle that I'm looking at is we need to think about assimilation and upward assimilation and outcomes, not just in terms of socioeconomic status, but also cultural, interpersonal, and intrapersonal relationships. And this is something that Professor Karam Lacey has really done well in her research, and it's a nod that I'm trying to make in my own research about Muslim Americans. Okay, so my research comes from ethnographic data that I collected among second-generation, affluent, suburban Muslim Americans in Metro Detroit. The parents and families in my study were connected to one of 3 Islamic parochial schools in suburban Detroit. Parochial just means a private religious school. They were all K-8 schools, and my observation typically took place in after-school activities, so things like Boy Scout troop meetings, after-school parties. I worked with parents at fundraisers. I went with them to social justice protests. I went to a lot of mosque functions, so things like iftars, the communal fast breaking during Ramadan, and other mosque events and lectures and things like that. I also conducted 72 in-depth interviews with second-generation Muslim parents, 60 of which were actually with the parents who were mostly of South Asian and Arab descent, and an additional 12 interviews with school officials, teachers, activity leaders, and people like that to help triangulate some of the things that I was hearing from the parents. Something that's really interesting about this group of people is that the schools are K-8. They end after 8th grade, and in suburban Detroit, there really is no high school option for Islamic schooling. So that meant that these parents had to then make a choice of where to send their kids next. Do they put them in the public schools? Do they enroll them in a private school, homeschooling, Catholic schools? Lots of options are open to them. So what I heard over and over again is that even if there was an Islamic high school, they wouldn't want to send their kids there because they want their kids to be fully fledged members of mainstream society, and they felt that high school was the right step to begin that process. A couple of caveats about this research. This is a very select group of Muslim Americans. In no way are they representative of all Muslims in America or even all Muslims in Metro Detroit, but they are a very good case for looking at strategic assimilation. Because they have quite a bit of wealth and power, they are able to enroll their kids in like some of the best prep academies in Michigan. They live in the highest ranked public school districts, and yet they choose to send their kids to these small Islamic schools, which tends to tell us that the Islamic identity is at least somewhat salient to them, which makes it a very good case to look at strategic assimilation. And so one more caveat about this study is that we can't know about third generation outcomes yet. These kids are still quite young. We don't know if the parenting has been successful or not, but what this study does show us is parenting practices that are reflective of identity construction patterns and patterns around assimilation. Okay, so let's jump into some of the findings. First and foremost, in contrast to other studies on strategic assimilation, parents in this study did not actively build boundaries around race and class. In terms of class, this group of parents was very comfortably situated in the upper middle class. They definitely wanted their kids to at least retain or even exceed their class standing, but they weren't really too worried that their kids were going to be able to do this, and it was perhaps this security in their class standing that allowed them to feel free to not have to erect such boundaries around class. And in fact, they really took the time to expose their kids to many different families of different socioeconomic backgrounds, even impoverished families. They felt that this would help build a good, strong moral character in their kids. And over again, what I heard is that parents wanted to raise humble, empathetic, just children, compassionate children. And they felt that this could be helping toward that goal. What's also important to note about this group is that regardless of ethnicity, they did not identify as white, nor did other people in their society view them as white either. And because of this, they really identified more broadly with this idea of people of color. They identified with other non-white, non-Christian groups, particularly African Americans, while at every step of the way trying to make clear that they didn't view their experiences with racialization as being on the same footing as African Americans, who of course have grown out of the legacy of institutionalized slavery, Jim Crow laws, and just other types of structural inequalities that they do not face, but they did still anyway face racial discrimination and stigmatization that helped shape their racialization. So a good example of when this came up was from Rana, a South Asian mother who lives in the northern suburbs. And she said, growing up, there was bullying. The kids would call me chocolate milk. I had neighborhood kids that would call us little Hindu and big Hindu, my sister and me. Now as an adult, I think it's amazing they even knew what Hindu was. They'd come throw eggs at our house, and when I came home to talk to my mom about it, I said, but we're not Hindu, we're Muslims. I'm like, they're so dumb. They're calling us Hindu and we're not even Hindu. My mom's like, they don't know the difference and they don't even care. So it's a quote like this that really cements this idea of being doubly foreign. People view them, they don't know what they are, but we know that you're not white and that you're not Christian, and that's all that matters. So you are foreign on two counts. And it's experiences like these that really help cement this sort of feeling of being part of people of color, being under that broad umbrella term. So it's not enough to just not build class or build boundaries around race and class. They actually work to actively deconstruct those boundaries. And they did so through social justice work and charity work. And by deconstructing the boundaries, they actively shift them. They take agency. They are able to change them themselves. But of course, as we know, when we do interviews, talk can be cheap. People can say whatever they want to make themselves look good. So it's not just what they told me in their interviews, it's also what I observed them doing in my ethnographic observation. So for example, one mother, Aisha, founded the Social Justice and Activism Book Club, which she billed as a book club to learn about socioeconomic and racial injustices, and how we as a group can better empower ourselves to do something about it. So this group, which was a bunch of suburban moms, mostly Muslim, in the northern suburbs, they would meet at Panera Bread locations to talk about books like Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, and Evicted by Matt Desmond. And so this group, when they would meet, discussions often hinged on feelings of outrage and disgust at politicians and other nonprofit organizers who held the capacity to do something about these social inequalities, but we were either unwilling or inefficacious in doing so. These parents in my study were also really active on social media in terms of supporting groups like Black Lives Matter and No Ban, No Wall. And in terms of No Ban, No Wall, there was a mother in my study, Miriam, who actually helped organize the No Ban, No Wall protest that took place at Detroit Metropolitan Airport in January of 2017. She co-organized it with Latinx organizers from the area, and thousands of people showed up. There was national media attention, and it was overall a great success. What's very interesting about this group, though, is they didn't just organize and attend these types of social justice events, they brought their children with them. So, for example, another father that I spoke to, his name is Mohammed, and he is raising 4 teenage boys. He spoke with so much pride of bringing his boys with him to a Dearborn Black Lives Matter rally. For him, raising successful kids was not just about socioeconomic status, it was about building that strong moral character too. And he thought that bringing them to rallies was one way to do that. So when I asked him, what does success look like to him? What does he imagine his kids are like when they grow up? He said, I think I'd be thoroughly disappointed if our kids didn't maintain the values, if they didn't have the high moral character, if they didn't have the high integrity and a high degree of social responsibility, if they didn't give a hoot about their community, I'd be very disappointed. So for him, if their kids grow up to be a physician, that's great. But if they're a physician who just goes home at the end of the night and doesn't care about their neighbors and other people in their community, that's not good enough. That's not success to him. They need to take it that next level. I also observed parents trying to contest and shift boundaries around race and class in their charity work as well. So one example of this came when I participated in a neighborhood cleanup that was hosted by Dream of Detroit, which is a African-American run, Muslim-run nonprofit in Detroit that's aimed at neighborhood revitalization and investment in the city. I went to this cleanup event, and that day I was paired with 2 mother-daughter Muslim teams from the suburbs, and we picked up trash alongside the Lodge Freeway. All said and done, as a whole group, we collected over 50 bags of trash, filled a whole dumpster's worth of debris, boarded up houses, worked on an urban garden, and people, I think there was like 45 of us that showed up, people from the suburbs and from the inner city working together toward this goal. And so this is just another example of the ways that parents are looking to get their kids involved, hands-on, to try and alleviate or remediate some of these injustices. One of the common refrains that I heard over and over again from the suburban parents at this event is, our kids need to see this. They need to confront this and they need to challenge it. Okay, so if class and race weren't salient boundaries to their identities, which were? The 2 main boundaries that I found to be most salient were around religion, between Muslim, non-Muslim, and generation, American versus immigrant. So in terms of religion, these parents lived in majority white suburbs, their kids went to majority white schools, they worked in majority white corporate American settings, but they didn't frame these types of interactions by race. They framed them along the boundary of religion, Muslim versus non-Muslim. And in terms of generation, this is how they distinguished between not themselves and the wider American public, but rather made internal variations between themselves and their immigrant parents or colleagues. They were American-born versus the immigrant-born folks. So in terms of constructing and maintaining that Muslim boundary, things like having access to halal food and maintaining a halal diet, common Muslim benedictions like inshallah, meaning God willing, or wearing hijab, these were all very common Muslim traits that you could enact very easily in Muslim spaces like the mosque or these Islamic schools or in homes. But as soon as you crossed that Muslim boundary, suddenly these same very common practices were treated with hostility or confusion or exotic curiosity. And there are moments in people's lives when they really notice that they have crossed from the Muslim boundary to the non-Muslim boundary. And people's stories really help this come alive. And so one really good example came from Samara, a mother of Arab and European ancestry, who talked about a time when she was in elementary school that she showed up. Their classroom was having a pizza party and she was so excited, but when she got there she found out that every pizza had been topped with pepperoni, an item which she knew from her parents' Islamic teachings to be haram. She said, "I knew I wasn't supposed to have pepperoni pizza, but I was also very shy. I felt uncomfortable saying I wasn't allowed to eat it, so I just cried instead." So in this moment, Samara recognized that she was very much outside the Muslim boundary. And now that she's raising a young daughter of her, her own, she wants to make sure that she equips her daughter with the right tools so that if she's ever in a situation like this, she has the confidence and the tools to be able to assert her Muslim identity without having to compromise her halal diet, without having to compromise her morals. And a lot of other parents identified their own pepperoni moment, or a time when the Muslim, non-Muslim boundary came into, was very bright to them. So in terms of the American identity, again, this is how they really differentiate themselves from their immigrant parents and peers. They regarded their immigrant parents with a lot of respect. They revered them, but at the same time were quite skeptical of some of their immigrant cultural behaviors or practices. This was most common in differences around the interpretation of Islam. So a lot of times parents noticed that their immigrant parents often worshipped and socialized almost exclusively with other co-ethnic Muslims, which had the effect of really homogenizing their interpretation of Islam, creating a really ethnically marked version of Islam. Whereas to these American-born parents, the Islam they're trying to pass on to their kids was this pure Islam, which in their ideal interpretation meant a pan-ethnic, pan-racial, decultured Islam. Oftentimes parents use the word culture or the phrase cultural baggage as a shorthand for any sort of ethnic particularities that could be imbued in Islam, and they worked really hard to try and remove that. So some examples of cultural baggage would be whether or not to participate in American holidays like Halloween or Valentine's Day, or even sometimes listening to music. But the most common example I heard of cultural baggage had to do with gender segregation in the mosques, prayer spaces, and social spaces. So in mosques throughout the world, gender segregation can be common, and so it can be imported into American mosques through immigration as well. But these American-born Muslims that I spoke to really felt that there was no justification for gender segregation in the mosque according to the way that they were reading the Quran and other Islamic texts. So on this point, a founder and board member of Rising Star Academy had this to say about the school's official policy regarding gender segregation. The board believes that there should be no gender segregation in Islam. This is a cultural effect. I mean, the holiest place in the world is Mecca, in the Kaaba, and there's no segregation there because that's where God and the Prophet talked. And the segregation, a lot of it is Arabic culture. It comes from that. So we want to make sure that the boys and girls learn to behave with each other. So I share this passage not to corroborate this particular board member's interpretation of Islam, but rather to show how one's interpretation can be indicative of their approach to their religion, or their approach of their identity and the way that they make sense of their social world. So exactly what is cultural baggage, what constituted cultural baggage, there wasn't a lot of consensus on this. And in fact, even like between really close friends, there could be a big fight about this. So some parents felt very comfortable letting their kids trick or treat to varying extents. Other parents said, oh no, that is definitely haram. We're not doing that in this household. Other examples of cultural baggage, a really good one was, so these third generation kids, their family's been in America now for 3 generations. They love Harry Potter. And so at one of the schools, Bristol Heights Academy, they decided the school wanted wanted to reward the kids for meeting all of their reading achievement goals for that marking period. They said, let's have a reading party. And the kids are all excited about Harry Potter, so they decide to throw a Harry Potter themed party, and the kids are really jazzed. Except then all of a sudden, some parents want to pull the plug on it because they're like, Harry Potter? No, that's devil worship, that's sorcery, that has nothing, that like goes against our Islamic beliefs. So then the American-born parents are like, what are you talking about? This is Harry Potter, this is all good. And so it really turned out to be a fight between immigrant parents and American-born parents about whether Harry Potter was haram or halal. So they ended up having to work with the Islamic studies teacher to come up with a compromise. They would throw the Harry Potter themed party, but the kids could dress up as the characters, but they couldn't bring the wand because the wand is where the sorcery came out. So it's these kinds of debates that happen all the time, and often the sort of dividing point is along this boundary of generation, trying to figure out how do we sort of meet what the kids want while also like being true to our Islamic beliefs while also removing that cultural baggage. So even though there wasn't consensus on what was cultural baggage, there was consensus over this idea that it was inappropriate to judge other parents for what they decided was right and wrong. So our kids maybe don't trick or treat, but those kids do. It would be wrong to say that they're not true Muslims or they're not good enough Muslims. We all just worship a little bit differently. And every parent had an experience when their kid came home from school or maybe from their auntie's house being told that something that they did was haram. They told me that because I went trick-or-treating that we're not real Muslims. And this is counters that parents will call being interrogated by the haram police, people who tried to go around telling everybody what's right and wrong. And so parents agreed that engaging in haram police behavior was not good and that is un-Islamic. That not judging is really what's best. And this is really important because this rings true from the strategic assimilation writing that Karen Lacey did with her subjects, African-American upper middle class folks in the suburbs. They wanted to raise their kids with a strong black identity, but they also wanted to sort of shield them from any sort of potential harmful effects of black culture. They wanted them to get the good stuff without the bad stuff. And that's the same thing with the Muslim folks that I'm talking to here. They want their kids to have the strong Muslim identity, but it's a very particular version of Islam. Not everybody. They don't want that auntie's version of Islam. Okay, so some major takeaways from this paper is that rather than to encourage their kids to fit in by de-emphasizing their Muslim identity, parents taught them how to successfully navigate being an outsider by consciously crafting a particularly Muslim American identity. They wanted their kids to maintain that halal lifestyle, and they wanted to equip them with the tools to be able to defend that boundary, to be able to go out and learn how to be outsiders. What's more is that parents overwhelmingly placed moral markers of success on equal or greater footing as socioeconomic ones in an effort to strategically assimilate. Right, so this goes back to that parent Muhammad saying it's not good enough that you're just a physician or a lawyer, you need to have good moral character too. And so by sort of creating and having this parenting strategy, what they're doing is they're telling their kids that we want you to become American by becoming Muslim. So I will conclude my talk by saying that according to recent Pew statistics, about 42% of Muslims are American-born, and it's a number that these statisticians anticipate will grow very quickly over the coming decades. And as that happens, they also expect that Islam will start to shed its immigrant identity. But what my research demonstrates is that this process has already begun. So, thank you guys.
Does anyone have any questions for Rebecca about her research? Yes?
How'd you get your sample?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I knew I wanted to do research on second generation Muslims, but I wasn't sure exactly what my research question was yet. And I happened to land a job for a Dearborn-based think tank, the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, where I was able to do research on Muslim Americans. And it was through that research that really I was able to gain entree and meet a lot of the folks that ended up participating in this study. Yeah, and maybe like some of you who may be embarking on your own research projects, I went to my advisor knowing that I wanted to study second generation Muslims. And she's like, okay, what about it? I'm like, something about race or identity. And she's like, okay, but what's your research question? And I was really struggling with what exactly my research question was going to be. But once I landed that job, I was sort of thrust into these Muslim circles, and I ended up being invited to this charity event where I was at a table with like 10 other Muslim moms, where they were all talking about what schools they were sending their kids and why, and they're just so frantic trying to make the right decision for their kids. And my research question just kind of came out of that very organic conversation. So it's just some advice I might pass on to you is, you don't have to force it. Sometimes the question will come to you. Yes?
Do you have any observations from the children themselves, or did you mostly focus on the parents and how they raised the kids?
Right, so that's another good question. It was actually just the parents that I really studied. The kids are kind of the vessels into which the parents are pouring in their love and parenting strategies and all this. So there's two reasons for that. One is just simply it's very difficult to interpret what kids say and what they mean. I think you need a lot of practice with kids to be able to interpret the meaning behind what they're saying and doing. But the other is a lot more practical, and that's just that I had to get IRB approval, and they do not like it when you have direct contact with kids one-on-one. You need a lot of special protocols to justify your research, make sure that you're not doing any accidental undue harm to these kids. So it's just a lot easier to do it in a group setting. I have a question for you guys. Why is it important to study religion in the context of race and ethnicity? Have you guys talked about religion at all? Yeah.
I would say that the reason is because of religion. So it's within all major religions, it has moral conduct to it, where it sets foundations of how to govern your family, how to act in society, how to behave as a law-abiding citizen. So it would make sense that if you use religion to create that type of field, then you use moral character to tell your people, hey, this is the right thing to do.
Yeah, for me that was the case, but I want to go a step further. What does race have to do with religion? Yeah.
Going along to what he's saying, I think that sometimes religion have cultural implications, based on what you do with your family do, and for instance, some people may argue that Judaism has the same cultural implications, and so does Islamic families, and that can shape what we think of as ethnicity based on what countries and what geographical locations participate in certain cultural religious practices.
Yeah. Yes, back there.
We also often talk about intersectionality in this class and the intersectionality of different identities. So we focus a lot on the intersectionality of class and race. I think it's important to study the intersectionality of religion and race as well, because people who have different religions and different races mixing together will have different forms of oppression.
Yeah, and I've definitely found in my research that sort of this racism and Islamophobia, they can go hand in hand. And so even though being Muslim is not a racial category, Muslims get treated almost like a racial minority. People are like, oh, I can tell that person's Muslim, or it has it can have an ocular dimension the way that race does. But then again, you can't tell who every Muslim that you see, and a lot of people get mistaken for Muslim, even though they're not. So people who are Hindu, who wear a turban, or Sikh people, they end up getting abused because people lump them in with Muslims because they're treating it like a racial category even though it's not. And it can be very confusing. What else, do you have any other thoughts about religion within the context of race and ethnicity? Yeah.
I was going to say, often when we're thinking of religions, there's a set race and ethnicity that we categorize people with. So even with the woman that was being called Hindu, so I think that we're not used to seeing different, the intersectionality of different races and ethnicities going into different religions, but oftentimes if we stereotype a religion to have a single race and ethnicity.
That's such a good point. And so if we kind of like think about our own implicit biases about Muslims, typically if like someone says like, you know, imagine a Muslim in your head, you're probably going to imagine like a vaguely brown, possibly Middle Eastern, maybe from South Asia type Muslim. But what's interesting is that at least in America, there is no majority ethnic or racial group within Islam. So like approximately a quarter of Muslims are Arab, a quarter are African American, about a third are South Asian, and then just various other mixes and matches in there, you know, Hispanic, white people, everything, converts. And so that sort of empirical reality butts up against our implicit biases, and it causes a lot of friction where a lot of Muslims are going like, well, what the heck? Like, you know, I may not cover, but I'm a true Muslim, or women who cover their hair for other reasons aren't Muslim, but they're being treated like a Muslim. Like, it's a very strange sort of, this is why we call it the racialization of Islam, because it's starting to be treated almost like a racial group. Do you guys have more questions or discussion that you want to bring up?
I had a question.
Yeah.
Just like the practicality of your research, I'm wondering if you experienced any pushback from the communities you worked with, and if so, like what that looked like.
I don't know if you could hear in the back, but we asked if I received any pushback from my research, like from the communities that I studied. And in fact, it was the exact opposite. So much of research on Muslims all has to do with like terrorism and what's your experience with that, and like tell me about all of these very tough parts of your life. And my research for the most part was really fun. I got to say, tell me about your kids. What's it like raising your kids? How, you know, tell me about what you like to do as a family, and tell me about what a headache it was trying to pick a school for your kids. And most parents, once you start talking about their kids, they do not stop. So the tape recorder just kept rolling, and they had so much to share, and they were honestly very excited to open up about their families and talk about like the minutia of their lives and the happy moments and memories.
I have a question too.
Yeah.
So what were some of the strategies that parents were giving their children to kind of deal with either experiences of Islamophobia or just kind of asserting their Muslim identity?
Okay, yeah.
in society?
So strategies for coping with Islamophobia, like first and foremost, school choice was a big part of this. Because so many parents know that bullying takes place in the public school, this is like a big reason why they want to keep their kid in a Muslim environment, at least through elementary school, and parents would sort of try and strategically find a good time to pull their kid into the public school. So sometimes that took place at 8th grade, sometimes 6th grade, maybe even a little bit earlier. It all kind of depended on their individual child's level of maturity, confidence, and ability to like speak up for themselves, kind of like what you're getting at, like how do you equip a child? If you're just a naturally very shy child, it's going to be very difficult to ever get you really to be able to be comfortable speaking up for yourself, but they hope that by the time high school rolls around, you will have those tools to be able to say, oh, sorry, that's a pepperoni pizza, I can't eat that. Is there an accommodation that we can make? Whereas for like a kindergartner, that's like an unrealistic expectation to ask a kindergartner to even know how to talk about those things. But yeah, that's all part of it. But basically, parents saw it as inevitable that their kids will get bullied on the basis of their faith, which is, you know, pretty depressing. So it's like, we know it will happen, but how do we best protect you? Which I'm sure rings true for a lot of other minority groups in America. Yeah.
I find it really interesting how you connected your report with Karen Lacey, my professor, and how the upper class families were buffering their children from like racism. For like Muslim families, you're correct. Like from an early age, they buffer them by taking them to like Islamic school. Like I grew up, I'm a Muslim myself, so like second grade to 6th grade, like my parents couldn't resolve to go to a private school, and Muslim school. So at the time, like we all went like religion, the Prophet stories, Quran, and we also buffered us from racism too, because we all pretty together, and like no one really never really talked about race that much.
Right, and it's just taken for granted for normal that, okay, time to go pray. You don't have to tell your friends, oh, excuse me, I need to step away for a moment, and have to try to like explain that to them. And so that was a big strategy. So the kids are young, they don't know how to really explain their faith yet, so we won't try to make them do that until they have the maturity or have the tools to do so.
So in general, it was to prayers for middle school and high school.
So what did you?
We emphasize more on praying together and like helping your classmates, and at the same time like avoiding peer pressure by the time you get to middle school or high school.
Right. Yeah. And so did you transition to public school in middle school?
For
or high
sixth
school?
grade, for sixth grade, transitioned like to suburb school. It was like a lot of like kids.
Yeah, like a lot of white kids.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so, that's something that the parents in my study said is like, okay, like this is what's going on right now, but we would love it if you come back like in 10 or 15 years and then do the study of like what happened. So someone like you made that transition. What was it like? And asking someone who's like now in college, maybe I could talk to the kids themselves and find out, how did that go? How did it turn out? Are you still Muslim? Are you still proud of your faith? Or how did you deal with it when you had those encounters? So I'm sure for you this sort of rings true.
Yeah,
And,
absolutely. Yeah, it does.
Yeah. Yes.
I know you didn't do the study on the lower socioeconomic Muslims, but do you think that the families that weren't able to afford a private school for their children to go through that process on their own and pull them out at the right time, do you think that there's going to be like a gap between those who can strategically like assimilate and those who like are hindered and bullied and can't quite find the right time to do that on their own?
Yeah, this is another really great point, and this is why I really stuck to staying within the same class, like this upper middle class, the parents that had the money to do this, that, yeah, okay, private school is expensive, but they had the resources to do it. Because other parents, they don't have those same choices, they can't make it as easily, or like in inner city Detroit, it's very common for parents to look to put their kids in like Al-Ikhlas Academy or other Islamic schools because the public schools are so poor. Whereas it's just a very different circumstance, and it's something that gives these parents, they have like buying power to strategically assimilate, which is a very unfair resource that many other families don't have. But class really, hopefully you guys could tell, like it sort of seeps through every aspect of this study.
So you mentioned the racialization of Islam.
Mm-hmm.
Simultaneously, did you notice in these communities kind of like the dilution of race because like the Muslim identity was like the main, like we talk about master status in this class, and so I'm wondering if like being Muslim is like what is the most important identity, and then like all of the races that encompass that are less salient maybe for this community.
Yeah, exactly. Basically, Islam, being Muslim, becomes the master status. And so, for these Muslims, the way that they interpret the Quran, they're basically like, we're all brothers and sisters under God. There are no nations, there are no tribes. We all worship together. And so, these parents in particular, the second generation who grew up in a very diverse Muslim community and like went to college at places like U of M-Ann Arbor and met Muslims from all different ethnic and racial backgrounds, they really embraced that. And when I asked them things like, okay, yeah, your kid's in elementary school now, sure, but like imagine 20 years into the future, your kid's getting married. What kind of person do you envision your child getting married to? So the bottom line was like these parents want their kids to marry a Muslim. They don't care what ethnicity or what race, which is kind of unique because like the immigrants are like, no, you're going to marry someone from not only our country, but from our particular like hometown or whatever. Like they want to marry someone within their ethnicity. But these parents said, okay, we don't care about that. We just want to make sure that you marry a good Muslim person. But to answer your question, yeah, definitely Islam became the master status.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
So the topic of like anti-blackness in the Muslim community is like encounters.
So the second generation are doing everything they can to combat anti-blackness in their communities. Like especially the people who are second generation Arab American, they're horrified by the things that their parents and the immigrants have to say about African Americans and blackness. And so they're really working hard to seed that out and say like, no, that there is no basis for this in Islam. It's insulting and it's just overall, it's actually haram for you to be making such statements. And so this group of people really saw them trying to dismantle that in every way that they can, as difficult as that may be. So yeah, it's a very good question. And it's something that comes up a lot. Like especially like in these mosque forums that I would go to, it was a question that would come up like, how do we deal with racism in our community? And there would be organizers trying to figure out, you know, how do we deal with this? And how do we help immigrants stop using insulting terms in their native tongue to talk about racial minorities and things like that? It's an ongoing battle that's going on in a lot of religious communities, but especially the Muslim community right now. Yeah.
Kind of along that line, would you say the move or like the push for a more pure Islam is a tool to combat that because of the teachings of Islam in regards to, you know, treating people differently?
Yeah. So this is like another nuance that I didn't really get to touch on this, but basically trying to create this pure Islam, this really refined, true Islam, ends up becoming like a tool to sort of unsettle immigrant parents' authority, to be able to say like, no, like I respect you and you're my parent and I love what you have to say, but your Islam is not right. Like, and it's a way of respecting your parents while also challenging them and being able to push back and say, did you know that in the Quran, if you read this particular passage, it says that we can't be racist, or however they want to interpret this. And it's a really unique way of using religion to unsettle parental authority. So it will kind of be interesting to see what will happen with the third generation, how they're going to unsettle the second generation's parental authority. Yeah.
Going back to the idea of master status, how do you think that Black Muslims, how do you think they identify what their master status is?
That is a great question, and it is not in my research, unfortunately. So my research, because it's all in the second generation, I really spoke to very few African American Muslims or Black Muslims in this particular study, because their experiences with racism and religion is worlds away. Like, it's just a very different way of identifying and totally different set of factors that they're working with. And there's a lot of really good emergent literature on African American communities and their ways of basically constructing their identity and against which backdrop. But yeah, I wish I had a simple answer, but I don't.
I can give you my answer for that.
Sure.
Okay. So aside from being a human being, at the top of the strong master status should be being Muslim, because of the values and the traditions we have to adhere to. Because religion, Islam, is just not just a religion, it's a way of life. So everything about it has to be practiced accordingly. So it would be Muslim, and then it would be like Black or African, and then the third would be just, yeah, I don't think I have a third one.
Do you think nationality would affect it?
Oh yeah,
Like
Somali,
American?
yeah.
Somali? Okay.
Can't forgot that.
Sorry, I don't know about your identity. I don't want to force that on you.
Yeah, those two in Somali.
Yeah, Somali.
In order.
Other questions? Anything you're curious about, or bringing in other things that we've discussed?
Yeah, and if you have any other questions unrelated to race and ethnicity, just about like graduate school, if any of you are thinking about that, you now have a panel of people who are going through their doctoral studies, and we can talk to you about those things too. But yeah.
Otherwise, let's give Rebecca another round of applause. Okay, so you are free to go. Enjoy your extra time off. If you didn't get to